Good evening. Welcome to the second night of the 2020 Prout Chapel BFA Capstone readings. We have three writers presenting work from their BFA theses tonight: Mackenna Finley, Eren Starcher, and Sawyer Stippich. Mackenna Finley is a fiction writer who delves into the ways that social mores and norms can twist character and lead to devastation. Whether it's an extreme story about a religious community that commands obedience to grotesque rituals, or the more realistic depiction of an abusive relationship, Mackenna follows the consequences of the premises of her stories with integrity through to their surprising but inevitable conclusions. Our second reader this evening, Eren Starcher, is a fiction writer with great range, who can write on the one hand a comic story that combines the discourses of an online Airbnb review with a ghost story, on another hand stories that seem both magical and nightmarish in their use of folklore, and on yet a third hand, realistic stories that take on issues of identity and acceptance. Our third reader this evening, Sawyer Stippich, is a poet who focuses both on the domestic and also on broader topics. Her work that focuses on the grandfather who likes to buy old-fashioned candy, Swedish fish for the neighborhood kids, or her grandmother who grew up with chickens and remembers them fondly, brim with affection. But there's also an edge to some of her work that looks at society more broadly. In one poem, perhaps an ironic contrast to Walt Whitman's I Hear America Singing, she writes, "The country is not singing for you." And yet other work finds inspiration in the weird, the witchy, and the sinister. I hope you'll enjoy the work of all three writers tonight, as I have.
Andromeda. It was a Saturday morning tradition. Ever since the 7th grade, Grace, Paige, and I had met at the village coffee shop 3 blocks down from the quaint Victorian neighborhood where we lived. I ordered a vanilla latte with an added shot of espresso. Paige ordered an iced mocha with whip, and Grace ordered a blackberry green tea with 2 tea bags instead of 1. We sat in our favorite booth in the front by the window and talked for hours. It was always the same. Nothing ever changed, and we liked it that way. This Saturday was a sunny morning in late August. September was just around the corner, and I watched as the world around me shed its summer skin and slipped into an autumn air. It was my favorite time of year. I loved to watch as the shades of green shifted to a bright orange that matched the warm color of my hair. Mama used to tell me that God made them change like that just for me. I was trying to spot the first hints of orange in the tree's leaves when I was startled back to reality by the clinking of Grace's teacup against her saucer. I looked and found she was staring at me with poorly restrained excitement. Her green eyes were even more vibrant than usual, and one of her fingers twisted around a strand of her dirty blonde hair, a bad habit she never managed to kick. "Yes, Grace?" I asked as I lifted my mug to my lips. I grimaced slightly as an unexpected bitterness collided with my taste buds. My eyes flicked to the frazzled barista behind the counter. It was her first week. It seemed she hadn't quite figured things out. "Did you get a new dress for Pyra?" The urgency in her voice gave me the sense that she had been waiting all morning to ask the question. "No," I responded, making sure to keep my eyes low. I hoped that would be the end of the conversation. Grace, however, seemed horrified. Andromeda. I should have anticipated a lecture the moment I saw the look on her face. Grace had never quite mastered the art of subtlety. "The ceremony is in 2 days, and don't," she started, seeing the intention to argue written across my face. "Tell me you're going to wear the same dress as last year. It's a big deal. Why not go all out?" I looked back out into the trees lining the streets and started counting the significantly outnumbered orange leaves, like glowing embers fighting against a sea of green. Flashes of last year's Pyra danced behind my eyes, the burning fire devouring a pristine altar, the preacher talking to a couple standing stiffly in the crowd, a mother and father looking anywhere but into the flames. I pushed the images away. "Last year's dress is just fine," I said with an absent mind, not meeting her eyes in the fear that she would see what lay behind mine. Grace must have sensed that it was a losing battle. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her pick up her teacup again, which usually meant she was moving on to a different train of thought. "So, Paige," Grace continued, her tone straining to remain casual. It was almost funny how she managed to make the tension between the pair feel so tangible. Can we expect to see you at this year's Pyra celebration? Paige smiled down at the table, although she looked anything but amused. I felt I had stumbled suddenly into a war zone. I always sensed that if it weren't for me, Grace and Paige wouldn't have talked at all. Even visually, they were polar opposites. Paige's delicately dark skin and black hair contrasted with Grace's pallor. Since the early years of our friendship, they had both developed warring opinions on the state of the world. Nobody would have guessed they could be friends. But maybe it was just easier to keep up the facade than to suffer the change. I haven't so much as seen the inside of a church since I was 12, Paige said, seemingly unfazed by the weight of Grace's stare. Why would I make an appearance at one of your bonfires? She kept her words light, but they hinted at a pressing darkness. I hoped in vain that Grace wouldn't push the issue. Well, it's not just a bonfire, Grace began, and it seemed she had more to say. Paige didn't give her the chance. You're right. It's a whole lot worse than that, isn't it? Even I felt the sting of acid in her voice, though it wasn't aimed at me. Silence hung in the air for just a moment too long. Just thought I'd ask, Grace said, and I heard a familiar clink of porcelain. A speck of orange tumbled to the ground in the distance. I took another sip from my mug and was surprised again by the bitterness I had already forgotten. I rode my bike home from the coffee shop like I always did. Grace disappeared to the library, and Paige's mom picked her up for track practice. The speed of my bike made the journey feel shorter. As the brisk morning air whipped around my face, I yearned for next year when I would finally turn 16 and be able to get my license. I would be all too glad to trade in my bike for the used car my father had been promising me for years. Anything to get home just a little bit quicker. I hated the silence the solitude thrust upon me. I hated the moment in between where the world seemed to slow and my thoughts grew louder. That day it was a cruel and continuous replaying of Paige's words that plagued me. It's a whole lot worse than that, isn't it? They were branded against the walls of my memory, and I felt sick to my stomach. Pyro was easier to swallow if you didn't think about it. Don't look too closely. Don't stare directly into those flames. Pretend not to notice the way the smoke smells as it curls into your lungs like no other scent on earth. Try not to think about the sacrifice, the hostia. Try not to remember how he smiled and shook your hand just last Sunday. I shook my head, desperate to escape the images I was seeing. I always tried to remember that Pyro was something we had to accept. I loved being a part of the church, or at least I thought I did. Mama raised me to love being a part of the church. I thought back to Paige. She was raised the same way, the same faithful parents. We were asked to believe the same things, and yet she managed to change her mind. Grace always said that she was just obstinate, but I wondered if she was just strong, stronger than I was. Maybe I didn't want to change my mind. Maybe I was just desperate to believe in something, even if it meant turning a blind eye to the blood on the church's hands, our hands. Lost in thought, I almost rode right past my house. I turned sharply into my driveway, dropped my bike hurriedly in the front lawn, and ran inside. As I closed the front door, I tried to shut out the unwelcome memories behind me. I didn't have to think about it. I had the luxury to be able to forget. So I pushed the dark thoughts back into the corner of my mind that I pretended didn't exist. I extinguished the flames in my memory and wondered instead what Mama would make for dinner that night. On the Sunday before Pyra, the preacher always read the same verses. Mama would even mouth the words with him as they rang out from the pulpit. I wondered if she was even aware of what she was doing. I could practically see the reverence dripping like honey from her lips. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. When the deed was done and the boy had been given as a burnt offering, God looked upon Abraham and his people with favor, for he had been faithful. Genesis 22, 9-11. It echoed through the sanctuary with heavy familiarity. As Mama's mouth moved silently, Dad nodded along. They made such a beautiful couple, Mama in her pearls and Dad in his favorite blue tie. They looked so young and attractive. It was hard to believe they had an almost 16-year-old daughter, and harder still to believe that I was the product of that perfection. I smoothed out my skirt, suddenly aware of how badly it needed ironed. When the sermon had concluded, Reverend John approached us as we rose from our pew and asked if he might have a word with us in his office. My stomach twisted. Almost at once I looked to my mother, but she had already turned towards my father. Although his eyes were on the preacher, his body was angled towards the door. He looked ready to run. I could see it, and I'm sure the preacher could too. But he didn't move. Instead, he swallowed a lump in his throat that might have been free will and said nothing. He simply nodded and followed the preacher toward the hall and down into his tiny office, my mother and I falling in place behind him. We all pretended not to be bothered by the heads turning to watch us go, but I know that at least I was grateful when we reached the privacy of the office. The room was warm and clearly designed to appear inviting. The door, which was always open, closed behind us with a dull click I felt in my gut. The preacher sat down in the big chair behind his desk, and my mother, father, and I sank into 3 armchairs positioned expectantly across from him. For a while he was silent, passing his gaze between the 3 of us like a heavy stone we were meant to carry, a cross we had to bear. There was a forced smile set on his face that created an expression that bordered on pain. The wrinkles set deeply into his cheeks told me that he had been in this position many times before. After some time, he settled his eyes on mine. I felt a heat rise into my cheeks. "Andromeda, you have been chosen for a great honor." These words were so different from the shouts of conviction he offered from behind the pulpit, obligatory rather than passionate. My stomach filled with acid, and out of the corner of my eyes I saw my father's grip tighten around the arms of his chair. My mother remained still. The church elders have prayed long and hard, and we feel God has worked within us to reveal his will. We believe that it is the Lord's wish that you be the hostia at tomorrow's pirate gathering. He looked at me like livestock. A heavy silence hung between us. Perhaps he expected me to start bleeding like the lamb he took me as. I did not say a word. I saw my father lean forward in his seat, but to my surprise it was my mother who spoke first. "We would be honored to follow in the Lord's will. We are not afraid to sacrifice for our God." Her words came out rushed and sloppy. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. Reverend John looked upon her with a sickening pleasure. I don't know if it was contempt or fear that filled me then. Even so, it burned. "The Lord will be pleased." The corners of her lips flicked up, and something, somewhere within me, began to bleed. The rest of the day was silent, nothing to fill the space between us. Nobody spoke, and the words unsaid piled up like firewood soaked in kerosene, just waiting for someone to light the match. The explosion waited until dinner that night to ignite. Mama had made my favorite, lamb chops. She set the table with the same plain white plates we used the last night and every night before. They laughed at me with their feigned normalcy. I took my place and bowed my head through my father's prayer. But my plate sat empty in front of me. My mother eyed it like an insult. I left it as an accusation. "Take some food before it gets cold," she said, careful not to meet my eyes. "I'm not hungry." I was surprised my words did not remain caught in my throat, or that I had the strength to find them at all. "Don't be I'm being ridiculous." I couldn't let her finish the sentence. The anger boiled over inside me. "Andromeda, please." There was pain in her voice, but in that moment it was only my pain that mattered to me. "You're supposed to love me," I yelled, jumping to my feet. Tears threatened to spill from my eyes, though I begged them not to. I couldn't bear to let her see the weakness falling in streams down my cheeks. I fought the urge to blink. "We are supposed to love him more." Her voice was still restrained, like there was a dam holding back the emotions she never let me see, emotions I doubted even she could understand. My father sat beside her in uncomfortable stillness, and for the second time that day I watched as he swallowed his objections. I wanted her to bleed in the same way I did. I wanted her to hurt as she hurt me. "I saw you smile. He asked for my life and you smiled. What kind of a mother does that? You'll be all too happy to watch me burn just so you can stand on your goddamn pedestal." Each word was louder than the last. Finally, my tears did fall, but they were rivers of fire and rage, devoid of weakness of any kind. My mother slammed open hands on the table, causing silverware to jump up around her. I jumped with them, more out of shock than fear. My mother had always come off as level-headed. She almost never raised her voice at all. I never knew her to be one to act out. Her eyes met mine for what I realized was the first time in our conversation. The usually gentle blue was swimming in tears and filled with a pleading I had never seen her wear. I felt my heart catch in my chest, and my anger began to melt against my will. I wanted to hate her. Why couldn't I just hate her? But she looked too weak, too vulnerable, too human. "Go to your room." Her broken voice made it sound more like a question than a command. "Go to your room and don't come back down until you can understand that it doesn't matter what we want. This is your cross to bear, Andromeda. It's time you learned to put the will of God above your own." Her words were mechanical, rehearsed, but they cut deeply still. Part of me wanted to lash out again. Part of me wanted to fall to my knees and beg her to change her mind, to choose me instead. But mostly, I was overwhelmed by the crippling fear that she was right. I turned and walked away towards my room, leaving my favorite lamb chops sitting, untouched and cold, on the same plates as yesterday. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stared at my ceiling for hours, my phone buzzing incessantly on my nightstand. I refused to glance at it. Of course my friends had heard. News traveled fast in small towns. I wasn't even sure how I wanted them to respond. I couldn't venture to guess if it would hurt more to see them filled with fear or indifference. When I finally checked the LED display, the sun was rising over the trees outside my window. Today I did not count the orange leaves. It wasn't worth it when I knew I would not get to see their return to green. The first message I read was from Grace. I wanted to be disappointed, but it was just like her. All she had to say was that she was proud of me for adhering to the will of God. I bet in that moment she was dreaming about what earrings she would pair with her brand new dress. I might have laughed, but there was no humor in this irony. Paige had called 17 times but left no voicemails. I guess she really didn't have anything to say. I doubt I would have listened to them anyway. She sent only one text with 4 simple words. "Please, I need you." People needed a lot from me these days. My next few hours, my last hours, were a flashbulb blur. All I had were scattered pieces of memory. I remembered the new white dress my mother had laid on my bed, but I couldn't remember her walking into my room to put it there. I remembered showing up in the church parking lot dressed in that simple gown, but not getting ready or even the drive over. I remembered the taste of bile on my tongue, but not when or how it got there. The altar had been prepared the night before. My family arrived before any of the other church patrons, as was custom. The preacher met us at the door and ushered us into his office again. The room was colder this time, but he wore the same hollow smile. He gave me a glass of what looked and smelled like wine, but I knew it held something far more potent. He said I was to drink it when I was ready. It was the humane way of allowing the hostia to pass from our world into God's kingdom. I thought briefly that I might prefer the flames. At least then they would have to hear my screams. The preacher left the room for my parents to say goodbye. My father mumbled something I couldn't bring myself to listen to. His voice was cold and practiced. It was clear he had planned his words the night before. I pictured him practicing, telling the cold glass, the bathroom mirror, that he would love and miss her. I responded only with a nod in his direction. My mother, on the other hand, said nothing. She merely pressed her lips against my forehead, and I felt tears spill from her cheeks onto my skin. The wetness spoke to me in ways I was not strong enough to bear. The bleeding inside of me ceased. There was nothing left to spill from my veins. I come to with a haze of memories from previous hours barely formed in my head. I must have drunken the wine from the preacher. The poison clouds my mind. I fight for consciousness. The first thing I realize is that I am stuck, incapable of any movement. I am aware of my body outstretched on a cold stone surface and can hear the muffled sounds of the crowd around me. I am awake and breathing, if just barely. The smell of kerosene fills my nose and makes my eyes water. The sting sharpens my thoughts, and the terrifying realization surfaces in my mind. The wine has not left me dead, but paralyzed. I searched myself for the will to scream out, but I am powerless, a prisoner in my own body. With my head angled towards the crowd before the altar, I watched the world move around me, as if from a glass coffin, stuck in this position of death, but excruciatingly aware. It is my preacher who finally lights the match. The flames climb up so quickly and violently, I doubt I could have escaped them even if I had the strength to move. The heat rises up around me and tongues of fire lick at my skin. Screams I cannot vocalize echo throughout my mind, and I see through a red curtain as an agony like no other consumes me. In the moment before the relief of darkness overtakes me, I see my mother and father in front of the altar talking to Reverend John. They both wear smiles. Neither looks towards their one and only daughter being devoured by the flames. They look so beautiful, Mama in her pearls and Dad in his favorite blue tie. Nothing ever changes, and they like it that way.
Hi there! I have recorded this several times, and each time it's awkward, so I've decided to just keep being awkward because that's my personality. I'm the awkward one. So, I'm in my little corner here, and I hope you are all in your cozy corner at home. Staying hydrated. That's good. Um, Now that my tiny PSA is out of the way, let's get into this. I like to write about the unknown, and a lot of that comes with urban legends and such. And this one isn't really an urban legend, but it is something that a lot of things touch on. Um, let's just get into it. This is Brother Mine. Walking through the destruction, Eleanor couldn't believe her eyes. Of course, it's common for children to have tantrums, but for anyone to cause such a mess was beyond all reason. It wasn't healthy for anyone to destroy as much as this child, whom she had noticed watched her every move since the moment she had arrived. He was innocent enough at first sight, his bright blue eyes and wild brown hair a sign of a healthy little boy who could possibly play pranks. Pranks! That's what her mother called them. Ever since he was born, Eleanor's brother Joseph was a bit odd. He had a tendency to become violent with no warning. Most notable was when he nearly set fire to a girl's hair in the park. He said the color bothered him. To this day, Eleanor is uncertain how her mother convinced the girl's parents not to press charges. She wondered how her mother convinced them to keep quiet, but couldn't convince her own husband to stay. Ever since her father left 2 years ago, Eleanor had lived her life in constant fear of her little brother and what he would do. She had been nearly done with high school, and for that she was grateful, as it meant she didn't have to deal with Joseph's outburst for much longer. Still, that didn't mean it was easy. Time and time again, Joseph proved himself a crazed child as he grew up, getting more and more violent with each outburst. She could clearly remember being called to the office as her mother pulled the both of them out of school because Joseph had fought someone unprovoked and they had to call the ambulance. When asked about it, he said he didn't like the kid's face. With Eleanor now in college, her mother was alone with the little demon child. That's what he was, a demon child. Somehow his destructive nature gets worse every time Eleanor comes home. Looking back at the room, she saw the gaping hole in the wall and the small fire that was somehow contained in the shattered pieces of their grandmother's urn. Sparing a glance to Joseph, she noticed his proud grin and felt a shiver run down her spine. Yes, definitely a demon child. "Mom," Eleanor called, turning to the doorway where her mother stood. "Can I talk to you? Alone?" Shocked, her mother nodded, her hand idly drifting to the pendant around her neck, the pendant Eleanor's father gave her. "Let's go outside," her mother said, leading the way. Outside was the only safe place. For an unknown reason, when Joseph turned 5, he refused to go outside and bit anyone who tried to take him. Before their father left, he had managed to get the boy into some sunlight and was shocked to see his son burn nearly instantly. The doctor said that while it was rare, it wasn't unheard of for some people to be allergic to the sun. From then on, Eleanor began to stay outside more often. "Mom," Eleanor sighed, standing beside the older woman's prized tulips. "I think it's time Joseph gets help." "I knew you'd say that," her mother said, shaking her head. "I'm not sending him away, Eleanor, that's that. Mom, he set Grandma's urn on fire. Her urn! It was an accident. Oh, like the neighbor's cat? Or lighting Jessica's hair on fire? Or how about that time that he threw that dog? Please, no more. No, you need to hear this. He's just troubled is all. He will get better. Just troubled is vandalism, Mom. Just troubled is smoking at a young age. This? Exasperation was evident in Eleanor's voice as she paced about and tugged her hair. Mom, he's a psychopath. A pyromaniac at the least. Every day I'm worried that he might. Don't you dare finish that sentence. Her mother stepped forward, her fist shaking. One had still clutched the necklace her husband gave her. Your brother would never. He's just a boy. Near hysterics, Eleanor grabbed her mother's arm, the one holding the pendant, and showed it to her. Her arm was covered in patterned scratches that the priest told people was a sign of all things bad. Although she doesn't really believe in that stuff anymore, she knew the priests were right about one thing. That boy isn't right. She remembered the day that it happened. After her father had left, her mother tried to bury her sorrow in her work. Eleanor heard him yelling about Fat Boy and how he wouldn't stay in a house with a psychotic woman who enabled him before the door slammed shut and he was gone. Unfazed by his leaving, Joseph had gotten bored after a few hours and demanded Mother pay attention to him. After several minutes of pestering, Joseph suddenly screamed and grabbed her arm. Eleanor had come downstairs to see her mother crying and holding her bleeding arm to her chest. Despite her pain and the intensity of her bleeding, she refused to go to the doctor. What respectable Christian woman would walk into a hospital with markings like these on her arm? People would talk, she had said. Just a boy? Eleanor asked. Her eyes filled with tears and her voice wavered slightly. She watched her mother stare at her own arm almost as if she had forgotten it was there. Then she slowly looked away and kicked her feet like a child being scolded. Without warning, she ripped her arm from Eleanor's grip and glared at her. Joseph is your brother, she hissed through her teeth. You should be more supportive and help him to get better. I'm disappointed in you. Any more talk like this and I'll make you leave. With that, she turned on her heel and stormed inside. Eleanor stood back in shock. The shifting of blinds caught her attention, and she turned to see Joseph looking at her from between the blinds. She could tell he was grinning that horrid grin that only crazy people could manage. Her mother pulled him away from the window and was no doubt going to make him his favorite meal for dinner and deny that he had done anything wrong. She would deny until her dying breath, Eleanor was sure. That was a little bit of a heavy thing, you know? Yeah, just stay hydrated. This next piece is a lot more, I'm going to say lighthearted. It's very funny, and I hope you're amused by it too. I know I was while writing it. Essentially, the question is, what would Karen do if she was haunted? That's what I'll give you. This is 1-star review. I am appalled. Truly so disgusted and revolted, I don't know how this company is still in business. This is the absolute last time I rent an Airbnb from this company. I suppose it was also the first time, but that just goes to show how bad this experience was. First of all, when I rented the house online, the place was beautifully decorated with a beachfront view and a nice neighborhood for kids. It was supposed to be a surprise for my children and a relaxing few days for my husband, so I went all out. Have the chance to treat the family, you know. Well, when we get there, the place is falling apart and the beachfront view was more like seeing Lake Erie on a cloudy day. I guess that was a beach, but it wasn't the beautiful beach I was promised. The house wasn't just a disappointing rundown version of what was advertised. No, the house was literally falling apart. The siding was oozing something. My daughter thought it was moss, but I don't think moss moves. And the windows were cracked and dirty. Upon entering the house, there was a horrible smell that made it impossible to breathe without feeling sick. We opened the windows and explored further, only to find that the beautifully painted walls we were promised were cracked around the ceiling and had scratches near the floor. This was advertised as a no-pet rental, so I don't entirely blame the company for any smuggled dogs, but with my son's severe allergy, let this be a warning for those of you who smuggled animals in. Don't. Someone could die. Anyway, luckily there wasn't any dog hair lingering around because my son didn't have a reaction. The kitchen had mold, the bathroom's faucets were faulty, and the bedrooms were dusty. All of this can be forgiven. All of this is fixable. However, that's not what this review is about. Kind of. You should still clean your rentals and give your customers what is advertised. No, this review is about the child. You see, we had rented the place for 4 days. We arrived on Friday evening and spent the night trying to clean the space so we could be there for a few days without being so horrified. I should mention that my children are 13 and 10 with my son as the youngest. So when I woke up Saturday morning to see writing on the walls, you can imagine my surprise. I didn't want to think it was one of my children, seeing as they should have grown out of it. When I asked them, my son said he saw something moving last night and couldn't sleep, but he didn't get up because he was afraid. Suspicious, I stayed up on Saturday night to figure out what was happening. My daughter used to sleepwalk and do crazy things, so I thought maybe she was doing it again because of the stress of the night before. To my surprise, it wasn't my daughter who was writing on the walls, but a little boy I didn't know. He climbed out of the closet closest to the room my children were sleeping in, and started writing in red paint. I could only assume he had stocked in the little closet he had come from. The boy was dressed in old clothes, looked dirty and starved, and his eyes were red from crying. I think I startled him when I first gasped at seeing him. He turned to me with wide, crazed eyes and his mouth open in shock. I asked what he was doing here, and the poor dear said he lived here. Unbelievable. I asked him where his parents were, and he said he hadn't a clue, but we should leave before bad things happened to us. What exactly happened to this boy, I couldn't tell you, but believe me when I say my heart broke at that. Whatever this poor boy had gone through, I was willing to help. I offered him some food, but he was shy and gone away while my back was turned. When I checked the closet, he wasn't there, but I did see a vent system he was big enough to crawl through, so I assume he went through there. The next day, my family and I went to the beach, hoping to get at least some time in the water. Like I said before, it was less of a real beach and more like a really big, kinda dirty lake. I wasn't even sure if we should be swimming in it, but my husband said he did. My husband said he did as a child, and he turned out fine. It was at the beach, resting beneath my umbrella and trying to pretend it was sunny enough to need one, that I spotted the boy again. He was just staring at me, like he wasn't sure if he should approach me. I took a sandwich out of the cooler and brought it over to him, but he didn't eat it. He stared at me and said, "You need to leave." "Why do you want us to leave?" I asked. "Because you'll die," he responded, looking out at the water. I looked out there too, trying to see what he did, but he was gone when I turned around. I'll give the kid that, he was fast. He apparently didn't like being left alone as he insists we do, though, because the house was trashed when we got home. I tried to get him to come out and fess up to his tantrum, but he didn't come. My daughter mentioned a ghost, but that's ridiculous. Ghosts aren't real. Besides, I told her there was a little boy living here, and I wanted to try and get him to come to talk to us. My husband suggested calling the police, but when we did, no one came. They had the audacity to tell us to stop prank calling them and not to call again. Not the fault of the company, but the city should really take this seriously. The last time I saw the boy was right before we left. We were packing up our things and the boy crawled out of his little closet space and walked up to me. When he saw that we were leaving, his eyes started to get puffy with tears. I offered to take him home with us, or at least drive him up to the station, but he shook his head and said it was for the best that I left and never thought of him again. Needless to say, I've thought about him ever since. I'm absolutely appalled that this company not only would allow this poor child to be here with no supervision, but that they would just let whatever happened to his parents happen like it did. I'm hoping that someone will investigate this house and this company like the police of this city did not. Well, that's what I've got. I hope I amused you. I hope you weren't too scared by some of the stuff in these. And, well, I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy and don't be afraid to be awkward.
Good evening, guys. I hope you're all doing well. Brief warning before I get into my poetry tonight. My cat is in the room with me, and I know she'll probably want to make an impromptu appearance at some point. So if you hear a yelling or a crying, know that that's not me. That's all her. Just expressing her inherent dislike for my closeness. All right. So I'll be reading around 11 poems for you guys tonight. All of them kind of centralize around the same idea of either family, fables, or capitalism and my inherent dislike for it. That being said, I'm just going to get right into it and get you guys through it. All right, this first one is called Harvestman. It's actually kind of borderline family and fable. It's set in my own backyard, although I don't think you'd be able to tell that if you were to look at my backyard, so I'll just jump right in. Harvestmen. Invaluable workers wake at dusk, crawling from the corners of dilapidated sheds. They do not dress for the occasion. Instead, they peel the skin off of their backs and start anew. Invaluable workers creep across damp fields, over the remaining stumps of freshly cut wheat. 8-legs skitter to collect the hollowed corpses of bees, careful not to drop them as they scatter through the stalks. The hive is left to wonder how the bodies disappear, not knowing that a stomach is their loved one's final resting place. Also, I'm deeply sorry if you dislike spiders. You probably didn't like that one very much. I probably should have started with a warning on that. This next one does not have to do with spiders. It does have to do with chickens, which is another theme that you'll see throughout my poems. There's only, I believe, 2 in this reading that deal with chickens. But if you've seen my portfolio, then you know I write a lot about them. It's somewhat embarrassing as I've never raised chickens, but they seem to be connected in some way. Okay. My grandmother's kitchen is chicken themed. She told me it reminded her of when she was young, living on a chicken farm with coops larger than their house. They would kill the chickens themselves, one foot on the head, the other on the body. It was her job to pluck the feathers from the flesh and boil the body to try to make them clean. I told her that this didn't sound like a good memory, but she smiled and said they always ate well. All right, following that one is an ecclesiastic poem. I wrote this one based off of Vincent van Gogh's Irises that he painted in 1889. So it's thusly titled Irises, 1889. Maybe he will love you more if you sit among the irises. Pay no mind to the wild bees or the heavy heat, and instead pretend you are a flower, shaken and stirred, a cocktail of creme de violette and gin. Push your hips into damp dirt and press your pale, warm thighs against bruised petals. Expose your neck to the open air and breathe in sweet summer's sunburnt soil. Place a hand between your thighs and let your hair tangle with the wild grass around you. Loose pollen will find a home between your open, chapped lips. Let it stain your teeth yellow. Okay, getting back to family on this one. This one is just about growing up in my grandparents' backyard and staying there while they babysat us during the summertime. It's called Backyard Summer. When my grandfather wakes for the day with the crossword puzzle already in hand, there are a dozen children buzzing in his 2x2 lot yard. The hangout of the neighborhood sat catty corner to a candy shop that sold Swedish fish in a brown paper bag, and Grandpa would walk to that store every day, secure the sweets, and return, only to be swarmed by popsicle-sugared hands begging for gooey red sugar. Okay. The next few are from prompts that I actually wrote just this semester, so they're as refined as they can be at this point. I would like to refine them a bit more. This first one was actually inspired by Lauren Ruth Ward's Did I Offend You? If you haven't listened to her, I highly recommend it. I think she's amazing. But it's called Only Fools Will Let Crows Win. The meadow you grew up in is filled with rotten stems and squelching petals, swallowed by the dirt, chewed up and spit out by the gnashing mouth of pollution and time. In remedy, blow dandelion seeds over what remains and plant aster with zealous hands. Cup water between your cracking palms and take trip after trip to the dying stream before it dries completely. Dirt will cake underneath your nails. Plant small seeds there as well. Something is bound to grow. If not, pack a suitcase of stems and petals, a handful of water, any remaining seeds, and progress to a new field of flowers. I will admit that I'm not quite sure how that poem relates to the song that I mentioned, but I know I like it, so I went ahead and threw that in there. This next one was actually written after a New York Times article that was, it had to have been written around 2008. The article was about sunspots and spotted whales, and so this one is titled Sunspots and Spotted Whales. Hypopigmentation traces a route over collarbones, around swelling breasts and bumpy stomach, before finding comfort at your hip. Do not let the whales see the calmer spots of color, the beacon of your flesh, lest they decide it's worth investigation. Those mighty swimming mammals will amass along the shoreline in hopes of viewing your stained and star-sullied body. They would risk the longest of lives for a glimpse of the woman whose skin resembles a failing sun. Okay, so this next one kind of gets more back to the family theme that I've been exploring recently. It's about a tree in my backyard that we have been swearing up and down for the last, 4 or 5 years is going to fall any day now. Every time it rains, we're sure it's going. It has yet to do so. So this one is called Tree of Hope. The sun burrows down my hollowed center, snaking its way through feeble limbs and shuddering shingles of cover. I ask if the wind will slow today. Stop pushing me toward that trembling water, that dark pit of sinking slime and snakes. I root myself in place with the conviction of gentle giants in bloom, a single bud. Okay, so we're getting down to our last 4 or so poems. This next one is another chicken one. I'd like to go ahead and dedicate this one to someone in my thesis group, Daniela. This one is for you. The Chicken Farmer's Girls. The hens are awake before him, as they always are and will be. He collects their eggs gently and whispers comfort to them. The chickens see a friend in work-worn denim and poorly woven hat who sprinkles seed in a half halo like fairy dust. He hums a tune soft as the plumage he pets and promises to bring his flute tomorrow. Daniela has been drawing wonderful chicken sketches for me throughout this semester when she realized my obsession with chickens, and for that I would like to thank her. So that one was for her. Alright, this next one, going back to the family again. This one was kind of inspired by the corn mazes that I would go through when I was a kid with my aunt and my cousins. It's called Autumnal Atmosphere. Chilled, crunching leaves fall from dry, clouded skies. Close friends do the waltz through a corn maze as dense orange wind lifts silk from the ears, and children craft illegal shortcuts, eager to say they won. Okay, let's go on to this next one then. So now we're kind of getting into, I don't want to call it my capitalist poems, because I'm very much not for capitalism, as I'm sure you'll be able to find out. This one is about the drills that most of us had to partake in when we were in school. Tornado drills, earthquake drills, even though we lived in Ohio and we rarely or never had an earthquake. This one is about the active shooter drills. It's called Only a Drill. The announcement was made with spongy breath and tittering teeth. Mumbled nonsense words painted a picture of harsh yellow skies and rotting wind suspended by straight-faced hope. You cannot speak sense into the panicked, but by God, you should try. Okay, and my final poem for the night is titled Big America. Drifting residential streets with no clue, hands grazing worn denim. The country is not singing for you, rooting for you. Your feet tangle the sidewalks with malt never distilled. No drink made vapor condensed. The house you just passed, do you smell it? Floorboards like burnt toast in mornings of powdered milk and poverty. Alright, and that's all I have for you guys. Thank you very much for listening. I know some of you had to, but I still appreciate it. I hope you're all doing well and continue to do so if you are. Otherwise, thank you very much and have a good rest of your evening.